Thank you, Peter. I'd like to preface the main portion of my discussion with you with a few introductory thoughts, if I may. It is fait accompli that for organizations and communities to thrive and not simply survive, that engaging in a global mindset has become increasingly critical. This must seem like a simple statement to many to make as we look toward the latter half of 2015. Yet those who claim to have such a mindset often act more locally. Further, for such a mindset to have a long-lasting, sustainable impact, there must be networks of collaboration. To this latter point, of course, the ITC is an excellent example. The dynamic to be explored today and strengthened through our dialogue rests on the critical ideas and essential change not only being propagated, but ultimately being realized via the critical mass of adopters reaching certain thresholds. And further, that these essential ideas are perpetuated via the strength of sustainable networks, a theme commonly referred to in these programs. It is important to stress that we operate under the assumption that critical ideas, yours, mine, Peter's, or other entities, are designed with positive intent. Of course, history has proven this not to always be the case. However, we will work with the assumption that all of our ideas are positively structured and seeks to benefit our partners, communities, and networks. With this backdrop, we note that experience identifies that continuous change, that is, environments in which there is constant change and little time for static performance or balance, leads frequently to more rapid change, and thus environments or organizations become discontinuous. This would be a good time to say, what? But the global exemplars of this scenario playing out are legion. We simply need think of any number of communities around the world who disrupted environments that had reached a well-managed balance point by adopting such strategies or changes, for example, such as strip mining or deforestation. Or, as we have seen through change, which is often manifested in technological advancement, such as developing fishing strategies and capabilities that ruin millennia-old fishing grounds and that have taken generations to recover. It is important to detail what we mean by discontinuous in the context of this presentation. There are several definitions, such as a break in a sequence in time, or perhaps a break in a physical community. But for us today, we will use the lack of continuity or cohesion as our working definition. Let me take one more step backwards to make a point. Cohesion binds us together from a familial perspective as well as from an organic point of view. Cohesion is essential in the physical world as it is in the business world and in the universe of grand ideas. We can agree that conceptually, cohesion is that stuff, if you will, that binds us together. A practical example of this cohesive qualities is that of surface tension in liquids. This surface tension, or the cohesion of water molecules, say, can keep water from spilling in spite of the fact that the water level is above the lip of the container. Once this cohesion is broken, such as by simply touching the water with our finger, we will see that it will spill down the sides of the container. As we continue our discussion, if you will, think of cohesion conceptually having two sides, sort of like a yin and a yang. On one side, what can be perfectly balanced systems, organization, or cultures can see their cohesion disrupted by change. Sometimes this change is rapid, and in other cases it is slow and can take time to realize that change is upon us, or in some cases upon you. This is certainly the case for both endogenous and exogenous change. A volcanic eruption is a sudden change that may disrupt or destroy a community. Many examples of this have played out over the globe in the last few months. But other climate and weather changes take generations to cause significant and final impact on populations or systems. Such was the case with the Anasazi Indians of the southwest United States. What was a thriving culture, a unique culture shared for generations, was ultimately abandoned due to long-lasting changes in weather patterns, crop failures, and perhaps influences from outsider tribes. Think about it. A cultural and political structure that had lasted thousands of years disintegrated due to change, or what we might say today were serious challenges to the cohesion of the Anasazi. On the other side, though, the cohesive qualities of a structure can be strengthened by change. Such is the case with an example of most trees. They become stronger in the presence of wind. They build up resilience and thus sustainability. The same can be said for people. A little change or stress tends to make us stronger and more resilient. One of the major challenges to continuity may be what we see in today's intense global dynamics. This is perhaps more easily framed by the question, are we all on the same page? In today's world, that may seem a rhetorical question, but it really isn't. We could further posit this question this way. If the world is discontinuous, are we migrating towards it, or are we devolving into it? In either case, to overcome discontinuity, there are advantages to the adoption of a global mindset or approach. We certainly recognize to do so requires specific knowledge. I will share some of what I believe is essential in a few moments to build the competencies necessary to develop skills not only for competitive advantage, but certainly sustainability and perhaps, in many cases, survival. Such thinking and approach is relevant to individuals as well as it is organizations or political structures. Sustainability and certainly sustainable networks demand new ideas. These ideas are like the wind to trees. They test networks and their members, and they make them stronger. These ideas, for any hope of ultimate utility, require their own inertia. If we use a physics analogy, this means the ideas we have must keep moving in a straight line and at some constant velocity. And once in motion, of course, they tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by some external force. New ideas. Again, we operate under the assumption of well-intended ideas being that they are well-intended. They require some critical mass for adoption. That is, a certain number or percentage of an affected group must adopt the idea for it to move forward, or as the authors Shui et al. In their seminal research referred to as a committed minority. Good ideas that cannot reach an adoption and deployment point are simply that, just good ideas. As noted, the critical mass being referred to is relative to the number or percentage of a population required to make an idea fly. And to use further physics analogies and examples, since nature abhors a vacuum, ideas there will be. Regardless of how well something is running, someone or something will attempt to introduce something new. But for these things or ideas to propagate longitudinally, they need what we might refer to as a push. This push consists of two critical components: the heretofore noted inertia, or as it is referred to in chemistry, activation energy, which when introduced into a chemical reaction carries a kinetic inertia to see that reaction through. In addition to this activation energy, there must also be idea merit. And I put merit in quotes for a reason, because it's important to us all. It means that there must be value and benefits in the idea. For ideas to be successful, even those in a human organizational system, certain dynamics exist. These dynamics tend to include two essential features. The first being that critical mass has been reached. That is, a sufficient number are in favor of an idea for it to move forward. And as we will note shortly, that number may not be as big as you think it may need to be. And secondly, when the critical mass has been reached, an idea or change is adopted. That is, a tipping point has been reached. This tipping point is best exemplified by the energy generated by the critical mass. You may recall that I used the term push earlier to describe these phenomena. Push certainly expends energy. The tenets noted above hold true for most types of systems. But before we get deeper into the idea of the tipping point as a mechanism to adopt ideas or manage or overcome discontinuity, let's look at a corollary model which shares the attributes of reaching the tipping point, but that had calamitous results. All readers of history recognize what was referred to as the Great Hunger, otherwise known as the Irish Potato Famine of 1845 through 1847. That famine resulted in direct deaths of over 1 million and countless other millions who left the country in search of a better life. Today, because of this famine, Ireland is thought to be the only country with a population less now than it had well over 100 years ago. Charles Mann, in his excellent book, 1493, does a superb job of describing this famine, what caused it, and the ultimate results and implications. In the end, the famine and its resultant catastrophe was born on the back of a plant mold known as P. infestans. The Irish, like many, looked for crops that were easily grown and that could sustain a growing population. Enter the potato, a vegetable that was native to South America. Though native to South America, those potatoes that made their way to Ireland were thought to come from Peru. How they were farmed became completely different. The differences in farming had everything to do with the mold P. infestans and its ability to move with impunity throughout Ireland and in other times to other parts of Europe. The Irish grew, for the most part, a single variety of potato, and I love this name, the lumper. They grew lumpers in extremely uniform fields and rows, referred to as lazy beds, which for a time were impressively productive. These lazy beds looked and acted a lot like growing fields in the Andes, which were known as huachos. However, the country and the agricultural minds at the time thought they had a better solution that would increase production and take advantage of technologies being introduced. These bright minds felt that space between the huachos was wasted, and thus enter much more modern row crops on a singly leveled field. What they didn't realize is that the space in the huachos was actually a natural way of forestalling the progression of P. infestans by preventing the spread of the mold spores. With the new ideas adopted, potatoes were grown much more closely together, and the huacho approach nearly disappeared altogether. Going to a level field versus furrows and rows found in the huachos allowed what was known as the potato blight to move unimpeded by spores being blown from plant to plant. The spores, very sensitive to UV radiation and rain, had so much plant cover that neither the rain or the light had much impact. Fully 2.1 million Irish acres were growing potatoes, and the Great Hunger was on. In this example, we see the characteristics of an idea. One that had ostensible benefits were present. An idea was presented, found to have merit, was approved by just enough to see the transition come to fruition, and for a while it did have some benefits. However, the destruction was further complicated by a second series of decisions relative to how the potato would be farmed. In large part, the story of the Great Hunger is one of a global system writ large in a much smaller ecosystem that witnessed wholesale collapse. There is value in this trip through history. At one level, anytime a new species is brought into a new environment, some analysis is required. We now know that. But that may have been too advanced in the early to mid-1800s for Ireland. But we do know now that whether an ecosystem, a truly networked environment, a political system or organization, that ideas can be adopted that have as much opportunity to cause harm as they do good. Here we saw the development of an idea: feed a nation with potatoes and make that better with advanced farming techniques. That second decision that not only had merit, but that had also received mass adoption and reached a tipping point of execution and result. But our discussion of an ecosystem is not enough to fully understand two essential dynamics: what equates to mass adoption of an idea and what defines that tipping point. Clearly, changing the growing technique of potatoes saw a tipping point realized. That point was when pea and fet stands had no blocks to its spread in a widely dispersed networked environment masquerading as millions of acres of growing fields. Let's look at this from two perspectives. Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, which was originally published in 2000, is still in print and widely read. You see it in airports throughout the United States. Gladwell posited that major change occurs when things reach a tipping point, or, for example, a moment of critical mass or threshold, or perhaps, as he finally put it, a boiling point is reached. His story of the famous U.S. hush puppy shoe might be one of the most cogent examples of something reaching a moment of critical mass that we could look at today. In this event, Gladwell was able to define when what he referred to as opinion makers began to wear the hush puppy shoe, a brand that had seen flagging sales and utility. Many others saw these opinion makers wearing the shoe and copied them. Fashion designers followed and used the shoes in their designs and runway events. Because of this, visibility reached an incredibly wide audience and thus reached a tipping point. In this case, the tipping point was mass adoption and resultant skyrocket in sales. Much of what Gladwell talks about is intriguing, but has an inherent quality, and we might have been able to intuit his findings had we given it much thought. But his magic was in making the connections between the players and giving life and names to each of them. His ability to provide exemplars was yet another hallmark of his efforts. But the question has to be asked: what does it take to accomplish mass adoption of an idea? That is, to reach, in Gladwell's terminology, a tipping point. You might be surprised the research that is out there suggests it is a much smaller number than you think. To that end, the lesson might be never give up. A good idea is a good idea. Its ability to manifest rests in the influencers you associate with, their networks, and ultimately the inherent merit of what you may be proposing. In another module, I will provide a bit more detail about what it takes to actually have an idea prosper, as well as considerations that can heighten or diminish the potential for success. In addition, I will discuss many of the influences that may affect mass adoption of critical ideas and why organizations on a journey of success in a discontinuous world should pay meaningful attention to them.
Thank you, Dan, for your presentation. Let's now go to Module 2 of this program.